the origins of Afrobarometer and my start at the World Bank almost mirror each other. I joined the World Bank when the Afrobarometer, the first surveys of Afrobarometer actually appeared in the public domain. And at the time, the World Bank was struggling to try to figure out the role of governance in development. And there was a kind of a courageous president who really talked a lot about corruption. And the cancer of corruption in development. And a lot of people in the World Bank at the time, I had just joined, but a lot of people in the bank at the time were kind of uneasy about talking about corruption because it was too political. And the interesting thing is that at the time, some relatively entrepreneurial researchers began to try and build indicators of governance. But they didn't have a lot of data, especially on Africa. And lo and behold, Afrobarometer shows up, and it becomes one of the, initially there was a lot of skepticism, but in the end, I think it won over a lot of people. And so it's great to see that Afrobarometer has emerged to be an asset and an important African institution that really captures the pulse of the continent. So congratulations to Afrobarometer. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, this thing about keynotes is kind of strange because sometimes you just have a speech, you read. I'm going to use some slides, so it may seem a bit strange. But I thought that some of the ideas that I wanted to convey can best be seen visually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some slides in this keynote speech. And so what I want to do is to start off a little bit about contextualizing African development and the kind of stuff that if you think hard about it, keeps you awake at night. Okay? So let's go to the first slide. So this is one way, kind of messy, but one way to capture actually African economic history in recent years. I mean, if you want to capture African economic history, you have to go back 4 million years, but that's a long way away, and we don't have a lot of data to go by, but at least in the last 60 years, this is one way to think about African economic history. Okay? And what does this mean? So at the bottom, of course, are the 1960, you may not see this very well, but hopefully you'll get the slides. But, we started from 1961 all the way to 2021, most recently. And this is the green, so on the left is sub-Saharan Africa. On the right, just as a contrast, is non-African countries that are considered low middle income countries. What you see here is Africa's growth, which is a summary measure of it is wealth, in a way, as we currently measure it. And what you see is the green light, of course, the green line is sort of like day-to-day, year-to-year kind of fluctuations of economic activity, which is normal. There are recessions that come and go. There are, recoveries that come and go. But what we do with the red line is to actually show what the average growth in a particular decade has been in Africa when we adjust for population growth. And what you see is that this is a region that for the last 60 years has been a low growth region. At no time, at no decade, has it grown above 2% per capita. Okay? By contrast, the lower middle income countries, early in the 1960s started at 3%. There was a real trough in the mid-70s and early 90s, 80s and 90s, and then it goes back to 3.5%, stays there for a long time, and even after the COVID pandemic, its recovery is up to 2.5%. But look at Africa, right? So not only do we see low growth, but we also these troughs. So a decade of less than 2%, another decade Following that, that is negative growth. A recovery that is back to 2% for a decade. And then in most recent years, in the last 15 years, we've basically lost another 15 years because the per capita growth rate is around 0. Can we go to the next? We capture that here. So recoveries are short, 3 years, and then back to a recession. Compared to, say, South Asia, which is about 6 years, a recovery. East Asia, that is about 7 years, like highly industrialized countries, right? Depth of expansion, that is the difference between the growth rates up from the trough to the top, is very shallow. Okay? As you can see, it's one of the lowest. Can we go to the next? And a lot of that has something to do with the fact that a lot of this growth is basically extractive based. That's what you see on the right-hand side, right? Natural capital is basically another way of saying extraction. Now, when you have that kind of growth, can we go to the next? When you have that kind of growth, low, unsustainable, or with a lot of volatility, and extractive based, what you get is the kind of problem right now a lot of African governments are struggling with. And what you see here is job creation for every growth, for every percentage growth increase in percent, every percentage increase in growth in Africa, East Asia gets about twice as much job creation. Similarly, for poverty reduction, the rest of the world gets twice as much. So African growth reduces poverty at half speed than the rest of the world. And so when you see this kind of history, this raises a lot of searching questions. Why is that? And so as I said, this is the kind of stuff that, at least in my job, keeps me awake at night. Can we go to the next, please? It's very costly. So on this left is what incomes in African households would have been in the last 15 years. So between 2015 to now, what African incomes would have been if they had grown at the rate at which they grew in that period, just prior to 2014. The incomes will be 33%, 1/3 higher, 33% higher, 35% higher. That's how much losses this kind of low growth, this stuck in low growth and lack of sustainability actually means in terms of just incomes and livelihoods that this affects when it comes to poverty. And it also shows in the fact that the region basically falls behind the rest of the world. That's on the right. So you can see, for example, the green graph, which is Africa's income per capita relative to the rest of the world, and it's relatively flat and declining towards the end. The purple line is East Asia, which is almost catching up with the richest countries in the world at 90%. And then South Asia is also making progress, but at a much slower pace, right? So this is the kind of costly outcomes that Africans are experiencing because of the kinds of growth that the region have experienced in the last 60 years. Next. So here are some of the questions then. Now, I haven't started talking about data, all right? But I couldn't build that without data. We couldn't actually get those insights without data. So the talk I was asked to give was about the role and significance of data in public policy and decision making. Okay? So here are some of those questions that these kinds of mining of data, looking at the data and staring at data actually gives you. Why is African growth so low? Is it because we haven't paid attention to agricultural transformation? Could that be the reason? Is it because of all the shocks in conflict, climate, disease that is quite prevalent and quite common that we haven't been able to actually have a handle on? Is it because of inequality? Is it because the human capital accumulation is low, right? So for example, one of the things that we compute in the World Bank is something we call human capital index. And a child born today in Africa, okay, will be only 40% as productive, 40% as productive when they turn 18 to a child who would have had a full complement of education and health. Right? That's a massive source of wealth to forego. So could it be that? Could it be about institutions? Our institutions are under a lot of stress at the moment, and a lot of them have lost credibility. Could it be because of the organization of production? Right? What's the role of research and lack of it? So these are some of the searching questions that come to mind. And to be able to answer these questions, to link them to the questions and the answers to the questions that particular set of economic history poses, unless we have data, we wouldn't be able to answer these questions. So what I'm going to do is to spend the next few minutes to talk about 5 things about data that I think we should really, really pay attention to and care about, and that will be able to answer this question. So the first one, next slide please, is really about, it's the data that allows us to to connect the dots. Okay? To link what we see to something else that we see that seems very difficult. So for example, what's the link between consumption inequality, which Africa suffers from? So Africa is the second most unequal continent in the world, second only to Latin America. To lack of mobility in the labor market or in society, social mobility. What's the link between those two things? But when you really think about the organization of production in Africa and all the obstacles that entrepreneurs and talented people face that traps them in poverty, then you understand why, in fact, there's very little social mobility. And that you can only capture through data. It's the data that allows you to have those kinds of linkages to connect the dots. Next, one other way you can connect the dots, this is something very familiar to all of you. This is the Afrobarometer data. I just borrowed this straight from Joe. You can see, for example, that among the Gen Zers, okay, the approval of government performance on jobs, economy, and health from around 31 countries is declining rapidly. Okay, so we talked about lack of jobs. We talked about the poverty levels in Africa, right? We talked about the performance of the economy. So it's not a surprise that, in fact, young people grade the governments very, very poorly here, okay? So you can see that there's been substantial reduction in the approval of government performance, especially managing the economy and creating jobs. But could it be related then to the way in which young people might be withdrawing from political participation? And is that a good thing? So next one, please. So you can see here that, in fact, check, for example, the yellow line, which says a lot of young people no longer feel close to a political party. Maybe because they don't offer them a message, a purpose, a program, right? Because maybe the political parties don't, right? So what is the connection between these things? So this is the kind of questions that data, really good data allows you to answer. Next. Second thing, one obvious avenue for connecting the dots, of course, research. to do research, really good research, you need really good data, right? And this is a paper. I mean, this is information I got from this paper down here, Research Deserts and Oases. And you can see that where there is data, there is a lot more research. So there are a whole lot of countries where we know nothing at all about how people organize their production, their livelihoods, their perceptions, their aspirations, and so on, right? And yet for others, we actually have quite a lot. But even then, so this is, forgive me, this is my profession. So this is the economic profession. And what we're looking here is all the papers that have been published, 27,000 papers that have been published in economic journals. And they rank these journals, usually 10 of them that are looking at development, the top 200 journals, all the journals, the top 200, the 10 that are coming from, that are focused on development, the top 5 ranked journals, and so on and so on. And then at the end is the proportion of African authors in all these papers. And you can see nowhere, even in places like South Africa, it's less than 1%. Okay, so if we want to understand this continent and create knowledge, first we need a lot more data. 2, we need a lot of use of that data for research and provide insight and connecting the dots, right? But also, more importantly, we need a lot of African researchers to work on this continent. And I think this is why an organization like Afrobarometer is very, very important, because they actually are an African organization, and their data is used a lot in the Africa region. So that's one of the things that I wanted to mention here. But this is one of those, again, eye-opening kind of tables. Next. Second, what do we need data for? We need it for transparency and accountability, obviously. And Afrobarometer is a classic case for that. It catches the pulse of the population, gets the opinion of the population, and if the policymakers pay attention to it, they would actually be better served by acting on it. But I want to give an example of transparency. So there are a lot of things African governments don't like. They don't like to be audited, for example. Okay? But I wanted to give an example of actually what transparency can do, right? So in the 80s, there was a big movement after the structural adjustments to make central banks independent and autonomous, so that the government don't just go to them and say, oh, print money, because I want to pay these workers who are going around demonstrating in the streets, right? So the central banks basically then were given a mandate and were made autonomous. And then 3 years ago, because of a war far away, the continent was inundated with lack of food, lack of fuel. And so what happened is that inflation just skyrocketed everywhere. And central bankers, to their credit, actually acted on their mandate. And so what you see on the left is what actually inflation looked like now. So it's a large continent, lots of countries. So not every country has succeeded. There's still some where inflation is very high, but there are a lot of them, many of them. A large majority of them have actually brought inflation under control. And look at the ranking of African central banks in terms of their independence. It's second only to Europe and Central Asia, right? So this is what transparency of, and autonomy and accountability actually does for you. It gets you better policy outcomes, right? So this is one of the reasons why, we need data for holding governments accountable. And hopefully they act on things like, Auditor General's reports. Next. Okay, so the other thing about data is, of course, how it can be incredibly important for all kinds of things that we care about, especially in production, right? So you can resolve weather uncertainty, whether you want, whether a plane needs to fly today at this hour, this evening or something like that. That will depend on a whole lot of things, but weather, uncertainty in the weather and prediction is important, all right? But there are a whole lot of other things that we need data for. Precision agriculture, right? So for example, telling farmers, oh, by the way, it's the northwest corner of your farm where there is a pest infestation. So you don't really need to go and, spray everything. Just go and spray there, okay? Or you tell them, oh, by the way, your soil is actually not very healthy. So you need to go and get lime and apply lime so that you can get, better outcome in terms of yields and so on, right? So we use data for, particularly for resolving a lot of uncertainty, but also for, decision making on agriculture, on diagnosis of, health diagnosis, on, school management, for example, to see, how many, are the schools here overcrowded relative to that? Are the teachers deployed better in different places? So this is all really, really important decisions that public policymakers want to make, and that can be really, really, data can be really, really important in actually helping making better decisions, right? So on, right? So next, I'm almost coming to the end. Increasingly, data actually allows us to create new technologies. Okay, a lot of you have seen these robots. Maybe you're using them in your kitchen. They come around and they clean up stuff. It's built on a lot of data. Billions and billions of data, right? Self-driving cars are tested, are being over-tested and tested, and they're collecting all kinds of data. And so we think of data as just these bytes, right? These digital numbers. But increasingly, data is you and me, objects, right? That these cars have to avoid, right? As they navigate the roads and things like that. So even our imagination of what actually constitutes data is beginning to change precisely because of this. ChatGPT, I don't know, many of you will probably be using ChatGPT quite a bit and will find it fascinating because sometimes it completely makes up data. As I did, I tried, and it gave me a completely new citation that didn't exist. So be careful with ChatGPT, which is what is my next point. Could we go to the next one? My next point is really that even as we actually are coming upon enormous volumes of data and are creating these new technologies, are making these better decisions in precision and be very precise, we are also facing incredible challenge in terms of misinformation, okay? And this misinformation through chatbots, through all kinds of platforms, right, is creating a lot of social tension, social fractures, and of course, potentially state collapse or societal collapse and conflict. So we have to be very careful. But even there, my argument here is that the point I want to make here is that actually good, accurate, verifiable data is one of the best ways to fight that misinformation. Okay? So even while people can use data for misinforming, you could actually use the same but a different set of data to fight that misinformation and to tell the truth. Okay? So that's something I thought I think we should underline. So next. So let me conclude, because I don't know how long I have been rambling around, but we all know data is now the currency of information and knowledge. So, and I just gave you a sliver of that when I ran through these slides. But I think it is fair to say that in Africa and African policymaking do not use data enough. Okay? I'm going to make a call for more use of data that captures the pulse of the population, such as Afrobarometer and many others. Increasingly, we get a lot of surveys, survey monkeys, from all kinds of sites, and that's important, right? We need better administrative data that captures the reach of programs, the impact of programs, the evaluation of programs, and so on and so on. Because I think that's the way for us to be able to judge whether a government program is effective, it's actually having its intended impact or not. And we need data that allows us to respond to a lot of shocks that we now experience, disasters, emergencies of all kinds, that are going to be just a lot more than we've seen so far, because our climate is changing, our societies are changing, and there are all kinds of tensions that are rising. We need high-frequency data to be able to use this to respond appropriately and usefully. And so that will be my concluding remarks, and thank you so much for listening to me.